So there's a blog post going around at the moment pertaining to the scientific invalidity of MBTI. The easy thing for me to do, I guess, in some respects, would be just to debunk the entire thing, destroy it with facts and logic, take the usual human black and white approach to it and say, well, it's all wrong. It's either right or it's wrong. It's either good or it's bad, that kind of thing. You get the drift. Well, actually, there's a few grains of truth to be taken from this article. I don't think it would be entirely reasonable of me to just dismiss it entirely. Many of the criticisms of MBTI are actually quite valid, even if they are a bit cliche. And much of the sentiments of the article itself do actually have a lot of very good points. So the title of the article reads, "Don't let your children take the Myers-Briggs. Type-based tests are not scientific." Okay, eye-catching. Using the word children is a fairly good way to get a good response from the audience. I mean, relying upon people's fear response in order to maximize their attention and maximize the likelihood of them sharing your content. Okay, a good marketing strategy in terms of the sentiment itself. I couldn't agree more. The idea of having children take the MBTI test and being told what their type is based upon their self-reporting seems not only illogical to me, but rather offensive. The idea of stunting a child's development and forcing them into a niche so early on. But for as long as you just use the MBTI instrument to kind of gather information on your child and their preferences, to just determine what's meaningful to them at the time, I don't see the problem. You can keep the type code in the back of your head. You can, over time, gather information and use this kind of self-referencing system to get a feel for not only how your child is changing over time, but also get a feel for what things are remaining consistent. What is the underlying personality? I think it would be a very bad idea to make any decisions based upon that score, but it's always good for the parent to, on some additional level, understand the psyche of their child. So I wouldn't say don't let your children take the Myers-Briggs test, but I would say do not assign your children a personality type. Do not tell your children what you think their personality type is. It sounds like a bad idea to me. And type-based tests are not scientific. Well, it depends what you mean by type, and it depends what kind of tests you're talking about. I definitely would say in our current state of technological growth, insofar as, the psychological domain, psychometric data and stuff is concerned, the only things which seem to be testable are things relating to traits. Whether or not you can correlate a core personality with consistent behavioral traits, well, that seems largely, to a large degree anyway, contradicted by the research, because while there is a level of retestability, while certain traits do remain consistent, such as being found by certain MBTI studies, they still fluctuate, and these fluctuations will be significant enough in order to move someone who's already on the cusp between, let's say, INFP or ENFP and ENTP, to transition to another type after about 20 months. So let's move on to the first paragraph of the article. Type-based personality tests like the Myers-Briggs, DISC, and the Enneagram, although popular, do not meet the standards of good science. Well, good science, bad science. I'm not entirely sure what you mean by that, but I would say, insofar as psychological science relies upon the consistent correlation between one variable and another, I would agree these areas are not good sciences, because we cannot directly correlate cognitive functions, personality, temperament to a consistent behavioral output, or even to a consistent self-reporting on various kind of questionnaires. But the fact that these things have yet to be correlated does not mean they have been disproven by science. That's a very different thing entirely. So to say they're not good science, I don't know, depends what you mean by good science. I mean, most of the good science in psychology is, in my opinion, utterly shallow, because it has to be shallow in order to receive consistent correlations between two different variables. For example, Myers-Briggs. Most of the reason Myers-Briggs only receives 50% accuracy and whatnot, or consistency if you like, is because of if you have a kind of a 5-point score, slightly agree, highly agree, slightly disagree, highly disagree, and then uncertain in the middle, that's a 5-point score. The 5-point score is, in my opinion, a good idea because it allows for a greater level of nuance. However, when MBTI gets rid of this particular score, the results become a lot more consistent because it just becomes a yes-no binary. You could argue the yes-no binary is a better science because it allows for more direct and consistent correlation between one dot and another dot. Because the more variation and variability you allow for, the more this variation and variability is going to occur. That doesn't make it a bad science, it just makes it harder to fit people into 16 different variations. First, from a psychological perspective, there's no such thing as personality type. Well, you've assigned the word personality next to type, so I'd imagine not, because personality is such a multifaceted concept. I don't think MBTI ever set out to say that their types encapsulate all of personality. They're just talking about a specific portion of personality. So To say there's no such thing as personality type is a bit of a straw man if you ask me. Personality is influenced by situations, context, unresolved trauma, and many factors. I absolutely agree. I'd even say cognition is influenced by all of those factors too. And I have to concede, this last sentence makes a very, very good point. The fact is, the dichotomies of MBTI, they are measures of value and perception. Your value and perception is going to change dramatically according to your situation, context, and unresolved trauma. There's no way around that. As somebody's life conditions change, as their personality changes, their values and perception will change somewhat alongside them. And this is one of the many, many reasons I do not ascribe to the MBTI dichotomies. And I do not believe these dichotomies can be 100% correlated with underlying cognition. A person going through life circumstances, well, of course they're going to become more or less introverted throughout their life. Of course a person's going to become more or less intuitive throughout their life. It depends what field they're studying. It depends upon their level of qualification. It depends upon the nature of their qualification. The intuitive score of MBTI has been very strongly correlated with the openness score within the Big Five. The openness score within the Big Five has been known to fluctuate across different life circumstances. So yeah, dichotomy scores are going to fluctuate. Insofar as a person staying within an MBTI dichotomy throughout their entire life, it's not going to work. Okay, let's move on to the next paragraph. Michael Wilmot, who studies the theoretical nature of personality assessment, stated, "The thing about personality types is that they're very interesting to talk about and they've been an object of public fascination for ages, but with modern, more robust research methods, most of these older typological claims are turning out to be spurious." Okay, so I actually had a look at what this particular quote was taken from. The citation relative to Michael Wilmot has referenced in this article, and it's actually a study on the type A personality. So actually this doesn't apply to MBTI at all. So again, it's a bit of a straw man from the author. It's a bit desperate. I don't think this particular appeal to authority fallacy needed to be committed. In terms of the words themselves, I'd say, okay, fair enough, but it also lacks any kind of substance. It hasn't actually backed up its claims with any kind of logical argument. It's simply stated what seems to be an opinion. Insofar as the type A and B personality dichotomy, I'd say that's fair enough. I mean, if I was going to think off the top of my head, I'd say that type A would correlate with a lack of openness, a high amount of extroversion, very high degree of conscientiousness, a level of disagreeableness, and maybe low neuroticism. Type B would generally be the opposite of that. Well, there's too many variables at play there. Again, it goes back to the 5-answer score I talked about before. As soon as you start adding in different variables, people are going to fluctuate from one type to another. But if you place things on a spectrum, then you can say, well, in one way I'm more type A and in one way I'm more type B. It's only when you start placing things into a binary and you start misinterpreting systems to imply that a person is either one or the other and it's fixed that you run into trouble. I'd definitely say that the type A and B dichotomy is oversimplistic, and I'd definitely say that any system which relies upon a consistent output of certain behavioral traits and doesn't allow for these traits to fluctuate across a person's lifetime is going to be unscientific and largely disproven. Other psychologists have gone so far as saying that type-based personality profiles are no more scientific than horoscopes. Well, I wouldn't personally compare MBTI, for example, a system that has somewhat, I wouldn't say exactly consistent, but somewhat consistent psychometric data backing up the employment of cognitive functions as a metaphor to encapsulate different modalities of value and perception, with a somewhat more mystical practice that seeks to predict the outcome of one's day or even predict the things that are going to happen to a specific individual at a specific point in their life relative to an alignment of stars and planets. I think a much more reasonable parallel to draw here, which is possibly the parallel the author actually intended, because obviously horoscopes is much more of a buzzword, are the 12 zodiacs, or 13 zodiacs if you like. This is the notion that relative to a specific time zone, a person who was born within a certain season, being of course a position relative to seasonal change across a year, is more likely to exhibit certain traits corresponding to a certain temperament. I personally wouldn't say that's very scientific. There's no research to back it up. I can see certain fluctuations, but I wouldn't say they're solid enough to actually form a typological system upon. I definitely wouldn't consider MBTI to be a system backed up by research. I definitely wouldn't consider MBTI as to be able to provide research adequately justifying the insertion of a person into one of 16 different types that they are supposed to fit within for the rest of their life. It doesn't work like that. A person's values and perceptions, which is what MBTI measures, again, a change throughout their life. You just can't do anything about that. But as soon as you place MBTI on a spectrum, let's say you have an ENTJ here and an ESTJ there, well, these are two different archetypes, and then you can say, well, people actually exist in between these two different things. As soon as you recognize that cognitive functions cannot be directly correlated with value and perception, then the cognitive functions become much more metaphorical. And thus, in this metaphorical sense, a person can fluctuate from being an extroverted intuitive, an INFP, to an extroverted sensor, an ISFP. It goes on, rather than viewing personality as an isolated entity or trait which is hardwired at birth, as Catherine Briggs viewed it, I wouldn't say that's necessarily true, and it depends what you mean by hardwired. Just because you say hardwired, it doesn't mean it's going to be fixed. Those are two very different concepts. The Big Five theory of personality views each personality trait as a spectrum, wherein a person scores a percentile rank on various characteristics such as extroversion. Well, to be honest, most MBTI practitioners do place people on a spectrum. They do give them a score, for example. And as such, yeah, okay, while they might posit that types are hardwired, a person will still be fluctuating within that type. So again, the article's inserting a bit of a straw man here because it's positing that MBTI does not recognize that characteristics are on a spectrum, which it actually does. I definitely think the Big Five is much more of a spectrum than MBTI is, because MBTI still tries to fit people within one of 16 types corresponding to their value and perception. But I'm increasingly beginning to believe MBTI does not actually use cognitive functions as any more than a metaphor. And for as long as cognitive functions are much more metaphorical, a person can essentially jump from one type to another, so as long as that type is relatively similar to the other one. And it would not surprise me at all if in the future MBTI dropped cognitive functions entirely and just focused on the dichotomies. Because these two things are highly antagonistic to one another. And in order to align cognitive functions with these particular dichotomies, the INFJ thing, these cognitive functions need to become a lot more loose and a lot more metaphorical in nature. But even within CPT, everyone's still on the spectrum. And the degree to which a person values one function is going to change from one day to the next. This is why I constructed the social archetypes. But these social archetypes can coincide with the cognitive type. Whatever score you get is based on many factors. Indeed, the research has shown that the conditions in which you take the personality test can greatly influence the way you answer questions and thus the score you get. Very good point, to be honest. I mean, in terms of MBTI, a lot of the research I've actually seen relies not only in self-reporting, but it doesn't actually do the self-reporting within a contained space. And even if it is in a contained space, if someone's talking about themselves, they're still going to be affected by their external life circumstances. Our research shows that your personality will change over your lifetime, regardless of intention, and further research shows that personality can even make sudden changes based on situation or experience. Again, I completely agree with this. This article does have a lot of valid points. Not only do personality tests generally just not work, and I've already made a video on that subject, check it out if you haven't already, but for as long as you seek to correspond cognitive functions to behavioral output or even values and perception, what is in reality a deep-rooted cognitive predisposition is going to be shown by the research to be something that jumps and fluctuates according to one's life circumstances. But the fact is, this kind of psychometric approach has been the only way, particularly in the past, that this kind of cognitive personality theory model, if you like, has been able to be proven in any way, shape or form. But the problem is taking that route, assigning traits and stereotypes and whatnot to cognitive functions, has actually disproven the entire idea. Do people have different values and perception? Yes. Do people's MBTI codes, for as long as it's reported accurately, correspond to that value and perception? Absolutely. Are these codes going to remain fixed throughout a person's lifetime? No, these codes are going to be changed according to experience, but that doesn't make these codes bad. It doesn't make them wrong. A problem arises, though, when you try to assert that a person's value and perceptions are going to stay the same throughout their entire life. They are not. Because all MBTI really does is measure a cognitive function insofar as how much a person values that function. And this is an entirely separate concept from cognitive type. I'd even say within MBTI, if you really want to be strict about it, cognitive type doesn't actually exist. There's an overlap with cognition, sure. But the reason I created the social archetypes within CPT, I haven't made a video on it yet, but I will. But if you're interested, definitely check out the CPT ebook because it does contain descriptions of the archetypes therein, is to allow for people's values and perception to change while the cognitive functions stay the same. For example, I will accurately test on an MBTI result as an ENTJ. Not because I'm a bouncy extrovert, of course I only receive a 55% extrovert score anyway. But rather because my extroverted thinking is a cognitive function I currently value the most. I value it more than my introverted intuition. And for as long as MBTI only emphasizes the degree to which a cognitive function is preferred over others, the degree to which a person relates more to that function, values that function and method of perception more than another one, It is, for all intents and purposes, a correct system. It just doesn't correspond to actual cognitive type. Because regardless of what function I seem to value more highly in any given moment, it doesn't change the fact that my predisposition is still towards a primarily introverted intuitive, introverted thinking agenda. So these two different factors, the cognitive type and the social archetype, are mutually exclusive entities. And this is why, in my opinion, MBTI is not a true cognitive model. It's not a bad model. I think it's a very good idea to use cognitive functions as metaphors to symbolize a person's preference to one system and modality of perception and value over another one, but it is still not explaining what's actually going on inside the head of any given person, because the system is preoccupied with what another person writes down on any given test. It is preoccupied with what another person values over what another person actually thinks. And there's only a loose correlation between each of those two different variables. But even though this article is making many valid points, it seems to be predicated upon a straw man, a misinterpretation of what MBTI is actually saying. I mean, the pretense of this article states that, firstly, MBTI seems to be encapsulating all of personality within a type code, which it is not, and it has never set out to do that. The article also implicitly states that MBTI is not on a spectrum. For example, the article says, rather than viewing personality as an isolated entity or trait which is hardwired at birth, as Katharine Briggs viewed it, the Big Five theory of personality views each personality trait as a spectrum wherein a person scores a percentile rank on various characteristics, such as extroversion. By inserting the spectrum of Big Five in the same sentence as describing personality types of MBTI as being fixed, the article draws a false inference that MBTI is not on a spectrum. Just because Katharine Briggs viewed a type as being hardwired at birth, it does not mean a person will not be on a spectrum within that type. And furthermore, many MBTI practitioners place the entire type concept on a spectrum anyway. Just because Katharine Briggs viewed type as being fixed, it does not mean all MBTI practitioners, employing as they are the instrument in the modern application of MBTI and cognitive function is more of a metaphor in the first place, also think that personality types are fixed. And CPT, of course, does both. Cognitive predisposition fluctuates within a type but remains fairly consistent, whereas social archetype, that is the degree to which a person values one function over another, will fluctuate across a person's lifetime. The article goes on to say, and this brings me to the core problem of type-based personality tests and why you should not give them to your children or yourself. Headline, Identity versus Personality. The author reads, identity and personality are two different constructs. Identity is much deeper and is how you view and explain yourself. Identity is generally conceived in the form of stories or narrations about oneself. Personality, on the other hand, is how a person consistently acts or responds to various situations. Well, first of all, I would say that these two spheres, if you like, heavily overlap with one another. How you respond and consistently act to various situations is going to be somewhat informed by your identity, and your identity is very much going to be informed by the situations that occur around you, often as a result of your actions. So if the author is indeed implying that these two different constructs are mutually exclusive, I would heavily disagree. But I definitely agree with the notion that these two overlapping spheres should not be amalgamated. Identity predicts behavior, and behavior over time reflects personality. Research by Daniel Gilbert at Harvard has shown that people's views of themselves over a 10-year period change. Yeah. When asked if they believe they are the same person they were 10 years ago, most people disagree. In other words, over the course of a decade, parentheses or less, your views of yourself will change and adjust. As those self-views change, your behavior and thus your personality will change. Again, a very reasonable point, but somewhat of, again, a straw man because it's implying that MBTI is saying something it is not. Because this entire counter-argument is predicated upon the basis that MBTI went out to assert that personality type, as within MBTI, seeks to encapsulate all things that are identity, behavior, and personality. When this is simply not the case, MBTI simply saw certain correlations between a certain portion of identity, a portion of behavior, and a portion of personality. But generally, I agree with the sentiment. A person's MBTI code is very likely to change over the course of their lifetime. I know mine has. And a very correct implication of this particular paragraph is that behavior, personality, these things overlap. If you set out to construct a model assigning cognitive functions to a score measuring a person's values and perception, as a person's behavior changes in response to an ever-changing world around them, to some extent, their values and perception are going to change alongside it. Ideally, identity should be held more loosely and viewed as flexible. In other words, don't turn your current identity into concrete. Carol Dweck, the Stanford psychologist who coined the terms fixed mindset and growth mindset, has found that those with a fixed mindset view themselves as unchangeable. They are purely defined by where they are right now. She calls this experience being trapped in the tyranny of now, because wherever you are now as a person is always and forever who you'll be, at least from the perspective of the fixed mindset. Interesting. I've seen this time and time again within this particular community. There are some people who use type towards growth. There are other people who use type to define who they are. And it is often rather sad when I see a person receive a type code or exist within a type code for a particular portion of time, and they suddenly become a walking caricature. They become a stereotype, a cliche if you like. And the person would have grown into the type. They would have spent a certain amount of years mastering the archetype, tinkering and changing their behavioral parameters in order to fit more neatly, for example, into a kind, loving, spiritual INFJ description. But as soon as they embody that stereotype to an acceptable degree, their growth is completely stunted. So yeah, the terms fixed mindset and growth mindset are actually rather elegant because they actually neatly describe what often happens within this particular typological community. And it's very important to be mindful of the fact that MBTI does not seek to define who a person is. It just seeks to place a person within a general spectrum of value and perception. And I do suspect that this fixed mindset the author is talking about here is much more likely to manifest in response to reading type descriptions than it is to receiving an MBTI code. And again, a bit of a straw man being inserted here because the author is insinuating that MBTI hands people identities. It does not. It simply gives people a kind of metaphorical framework with which to surmise their general predispositions. It is not a fixed concept. Conversely, those with a growth mindset do not define themselves by who they are now, but instead see themselves as something changing and developing. And yes, some people will use MBTI for good, other people will use it for bad. I mean, plenty of people who use their MBTI codes do so with a growth mindset, so I'm not sure this article is directly contradicting it in this sense. Dweck says that those with a growth mindset get to luxuriate in power of yet. If you fail a test or you don't reach a goal, you are not defined by where you are now, but instead see that you can become much more. I mean, this is all well and good, but I just don't see it as contradicting necessarily what MBTI sets out to do. Okay, so here the author gets to the point of these citations. Here's what might happen when you take a type-based test seriously. Emphasis on might. You adopt a label about yourself. That label becomes a deep aspect of your identity, a narrative about yourself, which narrative becomes something you defend against criticism. Labels can lead to what Harvard psychologist Ellen Langer calls mindlessness. If something is presented as an accepted truth, alternative ways of thinking do not even come up for consideration. I mean, I see that happening across the globe. It doesn't necessarily have to apply to personality type. When people are depressed, they tend to believe that they are depressed all the time. Mindful attention to variability shows that this is not the case. That's quite interesting. Type-based personality tests are not scientific, but they may encourage people to have a fixed mindset about themselves because rather than explaining personality, they give people a sense of identity in the form of type or category. Once people have made something an aspect of their identity, they can become blind or mindless to all the times when the label is false. True. Rather than considering who their future self is and striving for growth, a person can justify mediocre performance by saying, I'm a fill in the blank. Okay, so as usual, this paragraph contains a mixture of truth and falsehood. It is true in asserting there is a danger for people upon receiving a code to define themselves by that code. But all the paragraph is doing here is pointing out the danger of MBTI misapplication. Yes, if a person misapplies MBTI, just like if a person misapplies anything, to be honest, it can be an incredibly self-destructive tool. But I would acknowledge that many people seeking out online tests are doing so from a position of desperation. And I would say the desperation here makes MBTI much more dangerous than it otherwise would be, because a person would very much cling to an identity. And it's quite interesting actually reading this paragraph because it's echoing back much of what I said in one of my older videos. So yeah, I mean, that paragraph presented the danger of MBTI, but it hasn't actually debunked MBTI to any degree, because MBTI has equal potential to be used as a force for good as it does for a force for evil. But there are many applications of MBTI that do seek to put people on a forced path. You see, the concept of MBTI is now too broad a concept to pin into a certain box and say, this is what the system's trying to do. The question is, why would a parent ever want to encourage their child to have a fixed mindset? As a parent of 5, I don't believe any parent genuinely would want to. But that's a risk of taking type-based personality tests seriously or of taking any label seriously. Indeed, as Peggy O'Mara has said, The way we talk to our child becomes their inner voice. Okay, that last point is actually quite reasonable, because the fact is, if you believe your child to be a certain type, this will have an effect on how you communicate to them. And this could have very negative ramifications. But even though I agree with much of what this article has said, it has never fully drawn the connection between MBTI and a fixed mindset. I believe MBTI can easily be misinterpreted to give people a fixed type. But I don't believe it's possible for MBTI to ever do that in the first place. Because, as the article's pointed out, the things that MBTI seeks to measure and correspond to cognitive functions fluctuate all the time. That means any MBTI practitioner worth of salt will not be placing people into boxes. But you might be asking, well, to what extent then does this apply to CPT? And I would say, not much, if at all. Because CPT simply looks at styles of thinking. It allows for values and perception and behavior to fluctuate. It does not give people an identity. It does not tell people what they value. It doesn't even tell people what they're better at doing. It just gives people a general predisposition, and yes, general, not fixed, towards thinking in a certain way. The fact that everybody perceives information differently, the fact that everybody thinks about and processes information differently, is not really to be contested. It's already been acknowledged that some people learn in a radically different way to others. People who are diagnosed with various learning disorders, for example, which, whether or not it's a disorder is something completely different, but it's definitely a deviation. People who are diagnosed with a learning deviation, if you like, generally speaking, have that for the rest of their life. It can be mitigated, it can be channeled positively, but it's still there. This is how cognitive type works. Everybody has a natural cognitive predisposition which is highly unique to them. However, with this predisposition comes a different set of pathways through which they can engage any other cognitive function, if you like, that they want to. But yes, generally speaking, personality types, not cognitive types, but personality types are not fixed and static concepts. But the fact is, most of the time, MBTI practitioners do not view them as such. And in reality, a person's cognition is only marginally correlated with what functions they happen to value. Because the functions they value change across a lifetime, whereas their predisposition to think and feel in a certain way does not. And again, this is why I constructed the social archetypes of CPT. Because my archetype is TE based, and that's why I receive a TE dominant score in modern tests. But even though this article does make a lot of valid points, mostly it's just constructed upon a straw man. And that straw man being MBTI views personality categories as fixed, MBTI is not backed up by research any more than a horoscope is, and that MBTI codes instigate a fixed mindset more than they do a growth mindset. So as always, thank you so much for watching the video. I hope it was informative. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to leave a like below. It really does help the channel grow, develop and reach new audiences. And if you have not already done so, make sure to click that subscribe button down below with the bell icon next to it. That way you can stay notified of future content. Just a reminder, I do have a dedicated CPT type server, so if you're ever uncertain about your type or you just like to understand on a deeper level how that type applies to you as an individual, I definitely recommend you check it out. And if you haven't already read it, I highly recommend you check out the CPT ebook too. And just a final call to action, CPT is now on Patreon. We're actually growing in number at the moment. It's going pretty well. I really appreciate everybody's support. So if you're interested in supporting the channel on that additional level, it would be massively appreciated. But I want you to know that I already massively appreciate your support on this platform too. So thank you again as usual, and I'll be back in a few days' time. For now, take care of yourself.